Good evening. Good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture at AAC. We are welcoming Ariane Wiegner from Kirchberger Wiegner Rohde from Berlin. Thank you very much for being here tonight. She studied in TU Berlin and also at Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture in the US. Extensive work also with Stephen Hall, Barco Leibinger, David Chipperfield and others. But also her academic experience in teaching and research in Germany, in the US, but also in Japan. Currently, I think she's writing her doctorate in Kassel, but also teaching as a professor in Dessau. Their work about sustainability shows sustainability is not only about material and resources, but very much also about lasting usefulness. I'm very much looking forward to what you brought with you tonight, and thank you very much for being here. Please join me in welcoming Ariane Wiegner.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. And also thank you for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here and show our work. Mostly I'm showing our office work, and I would be very happy to also engage in a discussion afterwards about your topics and how they relate to what I'm showing. Yeah, I mean, you already said the most important part, but I always like to quote Mrs. Albert Vorbeck, who wrote Baunatz's piece about us a few years ago, and she titled our work with Struktur, Atmosphäre, Varianz, which is structure, atmosphere, and variability, which pretty much sums up what we try to do when we design new buildings, but also work with existing buildings. And so my focus today is not so much about laboratories or specifics about hospital reuses, but I'm focusing on more the general topics, which are, in my mind, robustness, identity, and porosity. And I will start with robustness and show a few new build projects that we're designing, because we believe that when we build new buildings, we already have to think about now how they can be reused later and how we can really already in the structure and in the spatial arrangements make that possible. And I like to quote Stuart Brand in that regard, because he says all buildings are predictions and all predictions are wrong. And everybody knows a lot of times when the building's finished already, the requirements have changed, and that's something that the building somehow should be able to react to. So the first concept I would talk about is flexibility, which means that you design building and structure and floor plans in a way that the space-defining elements, which is the walls and the ceilings, for instance, or the facade, can be added and removed later or changed around depending on the specific concept. And yeah, one of our biggest projects in that context is a high-rise building in Munich with Morris & Company from London. We won the first prize for this. And it's located in the north of Munich. I can try the, yes. So here you see a little bit of the BMW campus, the Fitz Future campus, which dates a while back, but was kind of master planned by Hen Architects a while ago. And this area here, these 4 buildings are completely new built in the next years, and they should form mainly office spaces, but also auxiliary uses for companies that deliver parts to BMW. And our task was to design a high-rise 60 meters that contains office spaces in the top parts and a hotel in the bottom. And those of you who have designed hotels or office spaces before know that those two typologies don't go together in that stacking order so well, because with an office building, usually you have a core and you try to maximize the space depending on your site and the distance rules and so forth. Whereas a hotel is usually a typology that has a corridor and then very standardized rooms, and all the rooms have to have a piece of facade, but can't be too deep also, because then it's a waste of space. And so, kind of rule of thumb, you end up with a building that's actually 16-meter deep, ideally. And we solved this paradox by inserting 2 inner atriums that you see below, so next to the core. And that gave us the possibility to make very regular hotel spaces around, and also give the building, of course, a spatial quality that just this corridor typology wouldn't have. And you see here the resulting floor plan. So above you see a typical office floor. Of course, as usually, you have to show that it can be open space offices and also cellular offices. We also included loggias on each floor so that you have really high quality exterior spaces. And below you see the typical hotel floor with the interior atria, and also, using this again, here we have loggias that are 2 to 3 stories high, and they bring light into the inner atria inside the building. And what you also see here is a bit special. We have the core as the load-bearing structure, and then we have an exoskeleton around. And this away from this area, we don't have any columns, as you see. So spatially, the building already is as flexible as it can be in our mind. And the main reason, I mean, generally we try to make our buildings flexible, but here the main reason was that we designed it during 2020, the corona pandemic, and it was already clear that maybe hotels won't be so asked for in the future, maybe offices also not. And we wanted the building to be designed in a way that we can close the atria floors later, for instance, and make it into office spaces or even residential uses. And how will that be possible? What we did, and that was a bit far-fetched at that moment, but now it would be possible also in terms of the German regulations, Zulassung and these things. So we used a structural system that's actually designed for making big industrial, how do you say, long-spanning spaces, Hallen, I don't know how to say, so big workshops. And that is, first of all, a very additive system, so you have a high degree of prefabrication, and when you're on the site, you can just assemble everything. It's quite quick. And the other good thing is that you have a post and beam structure, so you have a precast beam, then you have the steel precast post or column, and then you have the steel beams that ideally, depending on the loads, they are flush with the underside of the ceilings. And then you have pre-tension concrete slabs, which are hollow slabs, so that reduces the weight, obviously. And that way you can have very high spans. In our case, it was 9.55 meters, which you cannot do with another system. And what you see on the top right is a model view of the office floors. So our aim was not only to change the general use, but also to create really interesting office spaces. Again, it was the pandemic time, and people were asking, so how do we get people back into the office? And we designed the building in a way that there's so-called soft spots where you can take ceilings out or put them later in, and that way create really a three-dimensional connection of spaces, and together with the exterior spaces, that makes really a nice and variable interior space. Yeah, I mainly already talked about what is shown here. So yeah, each floor can be divided into different compartments. The loggias can move. Maybe I should go back one time. You see on the model shots also that the loggia is on the right-hand side once, and then it's below. So of course that's a bit of an effort, and you do it maybe every 20 years, but you could, because of the exoskeleton, have the thermal facade changed around without changing or without having to do anything to the structure. And so that makes it more interesting, and then the soft spots, and overall you have a very lively building. And another thing that's not just about structure and flexibility is, of course, it's a really big building. So it's 60 meter high, it's 60 meter deep, and we wanted to have some sort of human scale to it also, and also kind of read these layers that the building has due to the distances you have to keep to the neighbors. And so the idea was that the precast exterior columns have these scoops, and the scoops have different radiuses on the different tiers of the building. And that way, what you see on the right-hand side, you have different shadows that the sun creates, and that way the building gets this playfulness in the facade and also a bit more of a human scale to it. Yeah, the topic of flexibility, I already actually was interested in that during my studies, and the first project one of my partners and I did in that respect was in 2014. We designed a building in a typical Berlin block. You see it in red here. The codes allowed for like a main building and then an auxiliary building in the courtyard. And generally it was urbanistically about, you know, fitting in, showing maybe a bit of a contemporary facade and ways of living. But our main question was who's living there and in what constellations, and is it the right answer today to design for, let's say, the standard family in these types of buildings. And what you see here is a excerpt from the, well, it's a German book, Grundrissatlas Wohnungsbau. So it's a guidebook for floor plans for residential architecture. And so it shows a lot of projects, and it has these first pages where all the projects are compiled together. And what you see here is that all the floor plans that have this gray shadow are designed for the 4-person family, the standard one, and only the white ones have other concepts. So our take was that we have to do something different that can say, for instance, people live together as a community, maybe 4 people WG, or older people live with younger families, or families live there but want to stay and the children move out. What do they do then? And I would like to again quote Stuart Brand, who says, if we're wrong in the beginning of the building, how can we look into what the building does later? And he called that the scenario buffered building, which means that you design scenarios that the building should be able to fulfill and specifically answer these scenarios. So you don't try to design a building that can do everything, but you think about what is a realistic scenarios, and a certain number of that you design into the floor plans. And in our case, we did something that not many people did back then. Now they do, which is a good thing. We said we want to make it a skeleton building, even though it's a residential building, and kind of take ideas from office building typologies, for instance, this inner zone, which contains the wet spaces. And then we thought about, which I'm not showing here, first of all, how the different apartments could be arranged so that apartments can grow and also shrink, which is a bit complicated when they're owned by different people. And what I'm showing here is within one big apartment that you can have it as a kind of loft typology on the right-hand side, so you can have a completely open floor plan with just one box for the toilet. And you can have the maximum of 4 private rooms with a more public area like the living, kitchen, and dining that's kind of going through from north to south. And on the left, you see some of the intermediate steps that could be realized with this plan. And yeah, how can you do that? And now it also becomes a little technical. I already talked about the structure. So when you have the load-bearing structure, a skeleton, of course, you can remove walls or maybe even ceilings, like I showed earlier, to create different spaces. But you also have to think about the MEP installations, because if they're the last thought in the design, then they're usually in places where you don't need them when you want to change the use of a building. And in our case, we convinced the MEP guys that we can make these really slender shafts between the 2 columns, and that way have only like walls left over when we clean the floor plate, and also have the possibility to to, you know, either have the kitchen here or on that side, or have nothing here. So you're very flexible about positioning these wet spaces that need the installations. And another thing that I find very important about the scenario planning is, so we designed these floor plans that have private spaces that have maybe 12 to 15 square meters. So it's also about what sizes and arrangements you design into your scenarios. And then, of course, you cannot put a wall later just in any place, because, for instance, which is shown in the detail here, you have floor heating, you have sound insulation and other requirements. So in our case, we have this grid structure, and on the grid structure, we designed this kind of wooden, how do you say, wooden beam that's on the, that's always there, and that interrupts, for instance, the floor heating, but also makes some sound proofing, and that's the place where you can realize a wall or not have it. And what you see here in the rendering, of course, is that the structure also defines the space, so it's always showing in the reading of the space, so the building kind of also explains itself, which I also find important for communicating architecture with those who use it. Yeah, and we keep going with this topic. So one of our recent projects is an addition in southwest Berlin, where it's not so dense. So it's also a densification of this area. And the special quality in this area is that there's a little river, but also you have these linear, really green spaces that are in between the buildings, and that people use for relaxation and sports, and also, of course, as circulation spaces. So we wanted to kind of fit into that really green atmosphere with big old trees already, and designed a building that has an, the circulation into the, it's an apartment building, by the way, into the apartments as a terrace typology. And that the way that we also added these little balconies is that, so the terraces are meant for circulation, and people meet there, of course, too, so it kind of enhances the communal feeling of the people who are living there. Then they get some private spaces where they also can spend some time, and also this is now a climate buffer, so in our case, which is, yeah, I don't know, automatically maybe you would put this into the north, we put it into the south, and then the green plants here make a climate buffer, so in summer they're green and you have some shadow and some coolness, and in winter they're not green and you have enough light inside the apartments. And since this neighborhood is kind of monofunctional, we thought that maybe just living is not enough. Maybe it should be possible that a dentist is there later, or a little office or something. So we designed the whole building on a 1.35 m grid, which you see in the middle. And above you see the apartment mix that the client asked us for, with some bigger apartments, some smaller apartments. All apartments have this room that goes from both, from one side to the other. So you have this see-through effect where you see the greenery on one side and again on the other side. And the floor plans are designed in a way below. You see that you can realize an office space, for instance, here, and you already see that, which you see on the lower right again, that you can have no columns inside the floor at all. And that was possible here because it's a relatively shallow building. It's not too deep, and we designed these quite high beams that span from one facade to the other. And like I said, we have to think about the MEP always. So in our case here, we put them onto the facade, and it's kind of over-installed, so you have two shafts where you sometimes only need one, so that later you can subdivide it as you see fit, and always have the water and electricity and everything that you need. And again, these beams, when you have the open space, kind of give a rhythm and an understandability to the space for the people who use it. Yeah, I'm quickly jumping into something that I like to show when I'm teaching a lot. Jeanette Kuh did a studio in 2012 about the atypical plan. She was looking at deep plans, and maybe also as a tool that we use, and maybe that can help you also when you design new buildings, but also analyze existing buildings, is that you make these really reduced plans of the existing buildings, which show the load-bearing structure, the grid lines, and the installations. So in this case, you see always the columns here, and of course the grid lines that result, and then you see where the installations are in the buildings. And of course, also interesting and important for this topic is the vertical circulation. So where's your where's your stairwell and your elevators, especially in big buildings. And yeah, that way of approaching buildings I also took into a design studio in Bochum 2 years ago. I asked my students to reuse an existing parking house, which is in Hanover, into a communal living typology. And I always think that we should look at two things at the same time. One is, what is the spatial quality of what's there? So the students build models and arrange these little situations in there to look at, can we deal with that low ceiling height, for instance, or what happens when we make little portions of that higher? And also we looked at the structure again, and the students built big 1:100, I think, maybe 200 models of just the post and beam structure. And the requirement was that the structure has to stay intact, so you need the cores and the posts and the beams, and but you can take out the ceiling slabs. And the result was really interesting. So you have this three-dimensional matrix of posts and beams, and students also sometimes decided to go against the grid and do something diagonal, and that way create these really interesting spaces that kind of are balconies that are already half in. They all worked with double height spaces, of course, because the existing building only had 2.60 meters floor-to-floor height, which for residential, when you need some floor build-up and so forth, is not enough. And so you sometimes have these compressed spaces and sometimes the open spaces, and that way you have a spatial quality that is overall interesting. And I like this building, this picture very much, because it's also a very nice space that it's set in. But what I actually want to point out, so in the front you see all the models from this design studio, and what you see here is the urban scale models, and you see that within that matrix that was the same for everybody, the students created very different spatial answers about what the thermal or the inner spaces of the new use would be. Okay, now I'm briefly talking about another approach, variability, which is defined as designing spatial structures whose dimensions are in a way that they can be used differently. Of course, that has kind of typological boundaries. So within an apartment, you can use a certain space maybe for living and sleeping and working, or as a kitchen. It's difficult to fit a theater into an apartment, of course. And with that in mind, we designed a inclusive community in Petersaurach, which is a little town near Nuremberg in the south of Germany. And what is important to know from the urban design is that the actual town is here with a little main street, some shops, and all of the things that you see above the river is the typical suburban sprawl with single-family homes. Because they're very close to Nuremberg, which is kind of a growing city, they have more and more of these suburban areas where people live that then work in Nuremberg, for instance. And our clients were lucky to get this plot in the middle of one of these new areas, and so we decided typologically to kind of create also a little bit of a new middle for this just sprawl type area, and we looked into some traditional typologies like this Franconian rural typology. And the important thing was, maybe I should say a little bit about this community. So it was an existing group of people who had decided they wanted to live together. They were ranging in age from 0 to 87. And they had some members who were severely disabled. So one group member was had children. So she was taking care of 2 people who were in a wheelchair. And then there was also other people who had some disabilities, some were old, which is why it's an inclusive community, and their aim was that they all care for each other in a way. So they look out for each other, maybe they take turns if there's something to do for the little children or the older people or the people with disabilities. And for this reason, the heart of the whole design is this communal courtyard, which is not closed off to the exterior, but it's the main place where they come together. And to create this middle of this sprawl area, we also designed a Dorfplatz. Yeah, so that's usually the center of a little village. In Germany, there's a tradition that there's a certain type of tree and people get together and talk. And we also wanted to provide that. And we also have a little bit of a public use, which is an ergotherapy praxis. Does anybody know what that is in English? So it's this type of therapy where you build something or you play, you are kind of creative, but also working with your hands, which is the type of therapy that one of the members of the community is giving to their clients. And then we have two residential buildings on the lower part and like a big communal building that contains a community space, but also just practical spaces like areas where you can put stuff and have your cars and the gardening tools and these things. And of course, really important is the sequence of public, communal, but also private, because you cannot be in the community all the time. Then the community probably has some fights soon. So we defined the sequence that you enter the whole thing from the public areas on these three corners, then you enter into the communal court, and from there into the private living buildings. And then additionally, you have private gardens to the outside. So you can also be outside without having to talk to anybody if you don't want to. And again, we have a terrace as the circulation space from which you go into the buildings, which you see here on the first floor. And a very clean floor plan structure, which contains always an open space from one side to the other, and then more like a compressed space, which was designed in different workshops with each party to their specific needs. So in this compressed zone that you see here, you always have different arrangements of bedrooms, bathrooms, other spaces. And yeah, what's the variable part now about it? So in this case, we have this one space that goes from one side to the other that I already talked about. And when we designed, for instance, the bedrooms, we always made sure that they had a size which is sometimes small, but not too small, so that you can use it later, maybe even as a living room. Or you could use that Arbeitszimmer here, the workspace, also as a kitchen later. So that way, these spaces can be reused still as a residential typology, but for different uses within that. And you can change the size of the units because each unit has this entrance area. And here you can make a link to the next entrance area. And that way you can make a chain of spaces that belong together, or you can separate them later. And why did we do that here instead of the other approach that we did in other projects? That's because it's a building that's made of these wooden framework components that are prefabricated. So you see here, it's this kind of cellular structure. And these are not very flexible. So you cannot cut just a hole in there in any place later. So that means that the walls that are built now will probably stay the walls for the whole living time of this project. Yeah, and in the meantime, the community has moved in. The garden is not completely done, but what we're really happy about is that these terraces are really working really well. So all the residents say that they, you know, in the morning when they go to work and somebody's sitting there, they have a quick chat and maybe they meet later in the afternoon. And so it really kind of keeps the community together. And it says here first prize because first of all, it was a competition and we wanted to then do the project. And secondly, this community won the Bavarian Integration Prize recently for their building and living together. Yeah, and very German, something we didn't think about is that they put these doormats in front of their nice sliding doors. So I talked a lot now about structure and flexibility, but I will talk also about spatial qualities in a bit. And I think the quote that I have here from Christopher Alexander, he was interviewed by Rem Koolhaas and Hans-Ulrich Obrist a while ago. And he says, look, my real aim is I want the Earth to be beautiful again, to be beautiful, of course, it has to have in it nature and spirit and all of the different people in all the different places. The beauty I'm talking about has to do with indefinite differences. The nature of what is done is different in different situations and places. You know what I'm getting at, so all the cultures are different, all the places are different. But what he says, the important part comes now, but still the power of it comes from the elegance of the generative code that makes it possible. I don't think that's a contradiction, and that's something that I agree with very much. So yeah, very general code, and the life that fills it makes it special. So now I will show some projects from our office, which are smaller projects, which are reuse projects. And what I find interesting or important about these projects is that you really look for each building or each space and find the specific identity of the space, or the spatial quality, you could say, but actually the specific spatial quality that defines the identity of that very space. So one of our first projects was a duplex in an unused rooftop apartment in the center of Berlin. And the specific quality here, of course, was that you have this roof typology, you have a space that's very high, and we wanted to show that by making the floor plan in a way so we compressed the uses on that floor that were necessary into this little box in the corner, and made sure we have this big open space and the big height visible. And with the beamer you can't see it so much, but also there's a rounding under the top of the ceiling, so that makes it into this gesture that deals with the specifics of a rooftop apartment. And what also was very special about this project is that it's a multi-story apartment building from 1908 or something. And the staircase that's public below here became private on the top part of the building for this apartment that we designed. And again, here you have the special quality that you have the last flight of the staircase and then this really high space. And the residents of this apartment, our clients, they would always arrive with the new elevator on this level. And so we designed this top light here to give this kind of church-like character, which is very nice. So every time they arrive there, they have this really special place or space that shows I'm living on the very top of this building. Then very small, our own office, also in the center of Berlin. It's a building from the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s. And we kind of scouted it ourselves. It was empty, and 10 years before it got empty, it was used as a drugstore. And there was one special quality that we loved about it, which is the floor. So what we did in the end is just don't do much. We installed one wall and a few curtains to give the spaces some flexibility, and made sure that the floor can really kind of define the quality of the space, and is maybe enhanced by some colors of these colorful curtains. And another thing that's special about this former drugstore use is that you used to have this as one big space for the retail area. This wall in the middle is new by us. And then here you had the manager's office, where you go 5 steps up and another 3, and it becomes this really kind of cave-like compressed space, and that quality also we kind of enhanced. So you see that you have this really bright and kind of office-like space here, and really kind of emphasize this cave-like structure, which is, by the way, the breakout space for the people who work in our office. And yet another, so we do, as you can see, we do a lot of rooftops and conversions in residential typologies. And I will just briefly show another one. It's a duplex again in the center of Berlin. And what we found was this really ugly staircase in the middle. But in this area of Berlin, you were not allowed to change any walls. So it's a certain law that says the floor plan has to stay the same, and also the uses have to stay in the same location. And this ugly staircase was installed in a space that's only 1.25 meters wide or so. You see it a little bit in the axonometric here. And so our idea was that if this is such a difficult space, we should actually make that the focus space of the whole design. And we made many models of different variations and ended up with this kind of, slit at the end of a hallway where you go up into the second floor. And it's a staircase now that you see here out of steel. It's one piece. No, one piece wasn't possible, but almost one piece. But it looks like one piece now because, we almost had no space to have enough width of the staircase. And we created this really narrow, snail-like space that connects the two floors. And everything else is really like minimalistic and gray, and the staircase got a bright color and says, I'm special because I'm narrow. Yeah, and yet in other projects, this one is not completely finished yet. It can be the views in this area of Berlin that has these different really dense layers of different types of buildings that we also then connect with the little escapes you can have in the Berlin courtyards with some greenery. And that leads me to the next topic, which is porosity. I'm not completely sure how I'm in time. Can I just keep going? Oh yeah, that's good. Sounds good. Porosity. I saw that some of you had in your collages some mat buildings, and the idea of porosity, of course, I think every one of you knows, is this question, what's the figure, what's the ground, and if I have a very dense setting or if I have any space, the holes in it can be the interesting part of the spatial experience. And especially in campuses and hospitals, which is a campus typology, the mat building was very popular for a while, and there's a lot of interesting examples. I'm just showing the Freie Universität in Berlin on the top left, then the Children's Hospital in Amsterdam below, and this is a technology park in Moscow by Herzog de Meuron from 2012 or so. And what I found interesting is that in the explanation for the Freie Universität in Berlin, the architect said that in a skyscraper, the floor plates make that all the different disciplines or what's happening in the building are separated. And they want spatial overlaps, of course, so people communicate with each other and know what everybody's doing. And their answer was, so we want to make a ground scraper with a split level typology to ensure that everybody interacts. And I find that interesting because maybe not only the ground scraper is the right answer for that. And as you mentioned, I've worked with Stephen Hall a long time ago by now. And he said in his big projects that he doesn't want these typologies, the typical high-rise, for instance, which has a podium and then a tower, but he wants a porous block that ensures views, accessibility, and interaction between the users and the public, for instance. So in your case, maybe the question is, how do you get the mat building that you have as a base into the existing high-rise that you find here? And I will again show some examples how we dealt with this. I already mentioned the high-rise in Munich that has the inner atria, of course, but also these cut-out 3-story loggias to have these porous elements in this very dense spatial structure. And I also find it interesting to look at the existing, so I'm showing here a project which I can't disclose completely, but it's actually a general topic, so it's kind of a research topic of ours, which is the adaptive reuse of 1990s shopping malls, which we conducted together with an office from Münster, Maas & Partner. And as you know, the shopping malls from the 1990s, they're old by now, so a lot of them have to be rethought in a way, and also this typology in certain urban areas doesn't work anymore. People are not going there for shopping anymore. So the question is, what do you do with them? And they're very deep typologies, a lot of concrete usually. And in this specific case, it was not only thought about how can you use the base or the shopping mall itself, but how can you extend it towards the top levels. And it's, again, a skeleton building, so our suggestion was to install a wooden addition of 5 to 6 stories on the top, which goes with the grid that you find below, and then have a very flexible space that can have housing in it or offices or both. And then we designed this kind of cube that's in section that is 32 meters deep, but divided into two, but it's actually one structure. So you don't have to keep the distances between the two. And that structure actually made it possible to give this porous feeling and very interesting spatial arrangement. Just as an example, you see here the grid structure and then some residential uses, and in the middle you have this kind of canyon which does the circulation and has some cutouts, and that helps to have views in all directions. It helps to meet again, maybe between the office people and the residents. It helps, you can have a party in the middle maybe. And the porosity also allows for instance, doing gardening on the spaces, and that way you have a very livable and multifunctional space that is in addition to the interior spaces. And at the same time, the porousness can also do a very important job in terms of the climate regulation of a building. And I'm now showing an example from Tel Aviv in Israel. But I think that it's also getting hotter and hotter in the middle of Europe, for instance, and it's topics that we have to deal with now. And this was a competition for the new residency for the German ambassador in Tel Aviv. And one of the main features that you see on the right is the garden of the building. So they said in the brief that a lot of the, in the ambassador's residence, it's not only his residence or her residence, but also you have parties, the guests from other countries come, so it's also a very formal function that it has to fulfill, and the main character in that function is the garden. And so what we did is design a building that has all these patios cut out, and one reason for that is that we really wanted, which you see here in the section, the garden to come inside the building, so there's no distinction anymore between the garden and the building, and also to create a continuous experience when you arrive and you're led directly into the garden. And the other important aspect is that we designed the building in a very low-tech manner, so there was no air conditioning except for one space, which was the 200 people meeting space. And all the other climate regulation is through the so-called adiabatic cooling. So all the patios contain water features, and then the air goes across them, and that way the temperature is reduced, plus plants in the patios. And also, you may know this competition. It was won by Gustav Düsing, and he suggested to keep the existing building, which I'm really happy that he won with that scheme. The brief was very clear about that it has to be torn down, and we discussed for a long time. In the end, we said, okay, maybe if they want that, we have to do it. But we want to ensure that the new building won't get torn down after only 50 years again. So again, we designed a very flexible structure. In this case, it is steel, not wood, because of the termites in the area. And the steel structure then has these infills in clay. Clay is a material that you can find in the area. There's also a tradition to build with it. And when you make these clay bricks, you can, fill in a wall here and take it out later. It's very flexible. Plus, what we also did is we designed with the local regulations and how they count the areas in a way that you can actually add another story later when you need more space in the building. And apart from the clay, of course, we also, again, you want the flexible building. It's kind of a foreign building in a way in that area, but we also wanted to find the identity of the certain local place we were in. And there's a tradition to build with this limestone, Jerusalem stone in Jaffa, which was the original settlement of Tel Aviv. And so the facade kind of represents that stone. So in the floorings, we used the actual stone, and the facade was a burnt clay tile that has the same color. And yeah, I kind of like this image because it kind of shows that we try to fit in the local climate and also the local building tradition, but it also has this touch of the Kanzler Bungalow, which is the long time ago, the Chancellor of Germany used to live in these very modernist, but also kind of typical German bungalow style buildings. So we try to kind of merge these topics and ideas. And going back to the idea of porosity, I think, or to design not only the interior spaces, but also work with exterior spaces as design tools can also be used in maybe situations where you don't think about it directly. This is a project of ours. It's a listed building in the south of Berlin. And because it's listed, you can't change the exterior at all. And it should be, it was supposed to be renovated, and also the roof that wasn't used yet should be turned into apartments. And you see on the top here that there's some very small windows in the existing facade which aren't enough to light an apartment that you want to have here, but the office of the Denkmalschutz was very strict, so no changes to that. And so we came up with a scheme and plan that we cut out these little patios inside the roof. So now you come up the staircase, you enter an exterior space, which at first in Germany people say, what if it rains? You cannot do this. So we added a little roof here in case it rains. And then from there you go into the actual apartment, and so that way also, of course, you have enough light, you have a big glass facade, and you have this kind of meditative inner courtyard, which can be used, or it can also be, you know, like a miniature garden. And you see how it works in section here. And yeah, I don't have realized photos, but it was realized and it's rented out now. So the client was bold enough to go with that. And what I just on the side want to talk about also is that it was also an interesting project because you have to negotiate with the Denkmalschutzbehörde, so the local governing body that oversees all the listed buildings. And at first they didn't want the roof to be changed at all, or they said you can do it, but you cannot add an elevator. And nowadays you can't rent out an apartment or sell an apartment on the 4th floor that doesn't have an elevator. And but we understood their general position, and so in the end we reached an agreement by proposing, maybe I go one plan back. So you see here, there's this little risalit, which was always there for the staircase because it's longer than the space on the inside allows. And we added this tiny space that we also gave the stucco almost like the existing building, a bit different, and then the lines that you find in the existing building. And then it has open windows here, so you see the existing windows of the staircase, which is these colorful Gründerzeit-style windows, and then you have the elevator shaft here, which also has these windows, and that way it kind of looks like it's always been there, and in the certain materiality, though, it shows that it's an addition. And that way we got the okay to do that. And yeah, here's an image of the interior courtyard. Yeah, and lastly, I would like to talk about a topic that I didn't announce in the title, but that I think that is very relevant at the moment. And I understood also from your design brief that you're not only designing the buildings, but also the spaces in between and the exterior. And I think this project is very relevant to that topic. It's the competition entry for the new central entrance building for the Deutsches Technikmuseum. I don't know if you've been in Berlin. It's one of the really important museums in Berlin, and it has one main building here from the 1990s. Where one of these iconic planes is hung from the top of the building. So when you take the subway that runs here across the Landwehrkanal, then you always see this aeroplane hanging there. And the thing is that they don't only have the main building here, but they also have exhibition spaces here, and then it's really confusing because this is the main entrance, you buy a ticket there, and then you somehow have to run around here, and it's just a parking lot to go here, and understandably, so they asked for a new building here, a central entry building where you buy the tickets, but also they included in the brief 3,000 square meters of new program for that new building. And the existing museum has 30,000 square meters of usable area. And we thought this is such a sealed space at the moment with just stones, and then you know, maybe we unseal some, but we add another building. Somehow that's not the right answer for the current problems that we have with climate change and these things. And it's the building, it's the Museum of Technology. So it shows the history of how people invented new things to make problems of humankind, to solve them. So like the steam engine and these things. And we thought the current problem is the climate crisis, and maybe that should be showcased in the design answer for this. So I'm doing a little loop. I'm showing this diagram, which I find interesting. It's the McLeamy diagram, but the McLeamy diagram usually shows how the costs of a building can be influenced depending on in which design phase you are. And everybody can probably understand that. So in the very beginning, you can influence it a lot. You can say, I only built this building or that, makes a big difference. And in the end, when the building is almost done, you can't really influence it much anymore. And the same applies to the carbon footprint of a building. So of course, in the beginning, you can build something or not build something. So then that's a big influence. And then the further you go in the design phases, and especially during the use of a building, you can't really do much anymore to influence how much carbon it emits. And with that in mind, we said build almost nothing, and we proposed to plant a forest instead of the main new building. And I will now lead through all the different thoughts that we had about this and why we did it that way. So maybe I should go back one step. I said that 3,000 square meters were asked for the new building. 30,000 are already there. So our math was that 10% you can somehow find in the existing buildings. Must be possible. And so we said, let's plant a forest as the new technology that helps or prevents climate change. And then only plant, in the beginning, we really thought about just planting these umbrellas in between, which kind of guide you. They should have, there's also a height difference, so they should have been this ring of umbrellas that guide you into the different buildings. It wasn't possible because there's a subway underneath, and you can't do these pile foundations that you would need for a structure that's swaying a little bit, maybe. So what we did in the end is design only a little series of pavilions in the forest. So you see here is like the address-making pavilion, which has just a little bit of information and says at the main street, which is also at the waterway, look, I'm here. But the forest also says I'm here, very much so, I would say. Then there's a classroom, like a forest classroom, which isn't temperate, but it's open, and a lot of the clients of the museum are school kids. So the schools go there to teach the kids about technological history. And so they can sit there and have lessons then about how forests work. And then there's this little building here, which contains like an arrival space and ticket kiosk, and then just a roof space into this part of the building. And then there's a little stair tower and a bridge across in that main building because of the height difference that you had to maintain. And then here there's a ruin at the moment, and we said we would reactivate the ruin for the seminar space that was asked for. And the most important part, like I said before, was finding the spaces. So they wanted to have picnic zones, more toilets, a museum shop. What else? Yeah, so all kinds of stuff that went with this new entrance. And all the gray areas that you see in that plan are the areas where we relocated the areas that were asked for in the brief. And you see, for instance, in that existing building is the museum shop. I said we reactivate the ruin for the seminar space, and we have the picnic zones and the locker rooms, for instance, on the inside of the existing building. And the actual topic that I'm now interested in very much, and that kind of came with this competition, is, or it's two questions. One is the question of comfort. We've kind of come into a situation where every room that we're in any situation has to have 22 degrees or 24, depending on the norm. So in our apartments, the bedroom and the living room and the kitchen, everything is the same temperature. The question is that necessary, and is it really comfortable, or can it also be comfortable to wear a sweater and have colder temperatures in certain areas, depending also on what activity you do there? And for instance, in our design here, we asked ourselves, so in Berlin winter, for instance, maybe it's 5 degrees, you go into an interior space to buy your ticket, and then you're waiting in a line with 100 people, you have your jacket on, you're sweating, because you don't have the ticket yet, so you cannot go in and put the jackets into lockers. So we said, if the forest is the foyer for us, the forest makes shadow, it protects a little bit from the rain, it also makes a little bit more of a temperate space in cold climate. Maybe it's okay to wait in line with the jacket on until you have your ticket, and then you're distributed into the interior spaces. And we worked together with Bureau Happold on this, and they were actually the main people, and we went through really, like you see in these diagrams, all the different spaces and asked what's the comfort level you need and how can we make that with architecture or without architecture. And what you, for instance, see, some spaces you can compromise, for instance, the ticket kiosk here where the people who are selling the tickets are sitting 8 hours a day, of course that's heated, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair to them. So that's the one question, is the question of comfort, and that with that comes the question, does every program that you need require a space, an interior space? Or which programmatic elements can you just have in the outdoors or in covered spaces or in semi-outdoor spaces? And thinking about the campus you're working on, and also about, you know, meeting people, exchanging ideas, maybe just making some sketches when you develop something new. I think a lot of these things, or eating, at least in the summer, can happen outdoors, and that reduces the need for actually built matter or architecture. Yeah, and so with this topic that I just mentioned is something that we continue to research into and to deal with architecturally. And at the same time, the question is, so what's the role of architects in the future? With climate change, with social change, and with a lot of really big problems and complex problems that we have to solve. And our take is that, one, it probably makes sense, and that's a dialogue between clients and the governments and architects, to include architects very early on, in, even before the design brief is made, for instance, because a lot of the questions or the approaches would change if you had a spatial idea and approach to it. And the other thought that we have is that maybe architects aren't the lead designers in all cases anymore. And in this case, the landscape architect became the lead designer. So we proposed this idea with the forest, but then the landscape architect designed different fields of forests. So it's a Wald der begnadigten Bäume, I'll explain that later. A climate forest, a forest with a lot of water. So the idea here was really to say, we have climate change and we want to showcase a different approach than saying that technology will solve it. And what you may not know is that planting forests is much faster than changing how much energy we use, for instance. Because, for instance, insulating all the buildings and reducing how much energy we need for heating takes years. But when you plant trees, it automatically directly absorbs CO2. So enhancing forests, but also nature in general, is actually a way of much quicker answer to climate change. And that's why we said that's the technology of the future that we showcase here. And of course, that means that all the school kids who come there, but also the adults, can learn about different types of forests, about different types of trees, about the conditions and requirements they have, also how the forest in Germany has to change maybe because climate is changing. And like I already said, so the landscape architect designed these different fields. He designed different drainage patterns to ensure the different types of forests. He also designed the spaces in a way, because he made this plan of where small trees are and big trees are, and they make different spaces, of course, underneath them. And then there's this didactic path through the forest that has all these different stations where the different things are explained. And I mentioned earlier on the top right now the Wald der begnadigten Bäume, so that would be the forest of the pardoned trees. When you have construction sites, as you know, a lot of times still trees are cut down. And nowadays, technology, it's possible to dig them out with their roots and replant them somewhere else. So we said that of all the construction sites in Berlin, the trees can come here and have a second life. And maybe just a general thing about design processes. Sometimes there are these projects where then in the end you have the feeling that just everything falls into place, and that was the case here. Only after we made the whole scheme, we found out by looking at these green space maps of Berlin that were exactly on one of the green corridors for overall Berlin, where they should, of course, make green spaces, but also ensure cold air during the summer being brought into the inner city. And then also it's kind of like the missing link in this park, which is the Gleisdreieck Park, one of the biggest parks in Berlin, that connects here with the park that goes into the Tempodrom area in Berlin-Kreuzberg. Yeah, and with that, I'm at the end of my lecture. This is how we imagined the school kids to explore the forests in the new foyer of the Deutsches Technikmuseum. And we got an honorable mention. We didn't win because the client fought for 10 years to get this building, and he wanted the building in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk and insights. I think there were some solutions and questions, and maybe now you also will be here for our crit tomorrow. We will see some of the ideas resurfacing maybe. But are there any questions now?
Thanks a lot for the presentation. It was very nice. I had one question. You had a lot of projects in the existing building, revitalization and all of these things. Did you have any experience that the setting of the space, for example, the height of the ceiling, the walls, the corridors doesn't fit to the current regulations, for example? That would be amazing if you share that experience, if you had such a thing. And also, one follow-up question, which is a bit different. I mean, how do you see the adaptive reuse throughout the history of architecture? Because it's a very modern concept. And I wanted to know that, is it because now we are more uncertain about the future, that we are more thinking about that we have to reuse our spaces again and again, and the sustainability and all of this thing? That would be amazing also to see your take on it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, maybe to answer the first question, yeah, of course, we encounter these problems all the time. I didn't show today too much technical stuff, but I can say, for instance, we have a conversion ongoing at the moment of a 1960s building, which has been used as a hotel, and now it should be residential or apartments. And it was known that there was asbestos in it, and so we kind of looked really thoroughly at the whole structure, and of course then you find out the floor-to-floor height in that case is okay, as it is at the moment. But of course in the existing floor build-up there's no sound insulation, there's no floor heating, all these things we have to add now to make an apartment that's up to today's technical standards. But then also in the 1960s, especially these buildings, they used to really save a lot of material because they didn't have much material and wanted to save money also. And in our case, we have a not a cassette deck, but a rib structure. And where there's no rib, it turns out there's only 5 centimeters of concrete. So that doesn't fulfill the fire regulations. It doesn't do anything for the sound. It doesn't take any loads, so you can't put screed on it to do the things that I just said that we have to fulfill. And yeah, so speaking about everyday practice, I think you have to be really flexible. So for that building, for instance, in the beginning, we did many rounds with all the consultants, and in the end we had free spanning under ceilings with certain insulation on top to get the fireproofing, and then dry screed, can you say that? Yeah, on the top because it's lighter, and that way we just managed to fulfill everything and not reduce the floor-to-floor height, because that would be too low if we did higher build-ups. But now it turns out when they took down the existing under ceilings that there's even holes in the ceilings, so now we have to redesign everything, and they probably just add concrete and rebar and redo the whole ceilings. So yes, that happens a lot. And maybe one thing I would like to touch on is, I mean, you saw the example with the staircase, so when the hallway is too narrow, it's quite easy to find solutions to things like that. But the floor-to-floor heights are really one of the topics, the spatial topics with reuse, because especially, I mean, I showed examples from the 1910s or so. Those buildings have very high floor heights, they have high quality materials, but nowadays we're dealing a lot with these 1960s, 70s buildings. They have low ceilings, low quality building, and that's why I show these examples where, you know, you take out ceilings and make just different spatial arrangements, because you have to be creative with that. You can't, there's no standard solution, and in each case you have to find a new one, maybe. And about the second question, I hope I got it right. I think that reuse isn't so new, actually. So, I mean, even in ancient times, buildings were either reused as buildings or taken down and the material was reused. But nowadays, of course, we've reached an amount of buildings that is critical, you know, and so we have to emphasize that much more. Maybe you know Werner Sobeck. He did this whole series of books researching, first of all, what's the existing status of the architecture world in terms of sustainability. And there's a nice diagram that actually, or also in other places you find the same diagram. So since, I think since this year, the latest, maybe already since 2016, the matter on Earth that's been made by humans is exceeding the biological matter on Earth. And so that means we can't continue creating new matter. First of all, it's unsustainable, but also we already reached a point where sand is not really available anymore, and you know, you can't build with concrete everywhere because just you will have a shortage of material again. So we have to find out the solutions. So reuse means you keep the material that's already in the building mass, and also you save the energy for tearing it down and building new. And I think this tradition of tearing down and building new is really not so old. It's just so ingrained in us, no? It's from the fossil age, maybe since the 1960s. It's been that approach to just take it away and build it new because it's cheaper. So I think the decades before or centuries before, people reused everything all the time. Yeah.
But speaking of which, do you think we still need to leave a mark in the sense that if we were to construct new buildings that could survive for only very short time spans, that we could still build new? Is it something that could be considered sustainable?
So I think I acoustically didn't understand everything. We build new, and why are they only short?
Yes, if we were to build only short time span buildings, as we have done for the past 50, 60 years, or as is still done in most parts of the world, do you think there is a way to do this still sustainably? Or is this impossible?
Thank you for the question. Yes, of course, there is a way to do that. Yeah, I didn't talk about that today. That's another topic that I'm working on my doctorate on also. It's the question of temporality of buildings. So actually one of the questions we should ask in the very beginning of every project is, for how long is this meant? So for the past decades, we've always built everything as if it's made for, I don't know, 100 years, at least in certain parts of the buildings, but at the same time the use maybe was only, you know, you only knew the next 10 years, then it's paid off, and then nobody knows what happens. And so with the high-rise I showed, we said if we build 44,000 square meters, then it should last at least 150 years, so the concrete is the right solution. But if we know that we have a use that's shorter or we're not sure, then of course it makes sense to build with materials that can be either reused but also reintegrated into the natural or the biological cycle. So another thing I'm doing with my students, which I didn't show today, is actually make degradable structures that are completely degradable. So all parts either compost or are mineral materials, and we also do little experiments. We burn the stuff or we ruin it with water. So I think that's the answer to your question, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will think of many more questions, but there's also an opportunity to ask them next door over a glass of wine. So please join me in thanking Ariane Wiegner again for being here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.